Julius Evola. The Aryan Doctrine of Combat and Victory. The decline of the modern West, according to the view of a famous critic of civilization, clearly possesses two salient characteristics: in the first place the pathological development of activity for its own sake, in the second place contempt for the values of knowledge and contemplation. By knowledge this critic does not mean rationalism, intellectualism or the vain games of men of letters, nor by contemplation does he mean cutting oneself off from the world, renunciation or a misunderstood form of monastic detachment. Knowledge and contemplation represent for him, rather, the most normal and appropriate forms of participation of man in supernatural, superhuman and supra-rational reality. Notwithstanding this clarification, his view involves what is, to us, an unacceptable presupposition. In fact, he has already tacitly implied that every act in the material domain is limiting and that the highest spiritual sphere is accessible only in ways different from those of action. In this premise the influence of a vision of life is clearly recognizable which, in its essence, remains strange to the spirit of the Aryan race, even if it is so embedded in the thought of the Christianized West that it can even be found revived in the imperial conception of Dante. The opposition between action and contemplation, however, was unknown to the ancient Aryans. Action and contemplation were not regarded as the two terms of an opposition. They designated merely two distinct paths to the same spiritual realization. In other words, it was thought that man could overcome the conditioning of individuality and participate in the supernatural reality by means of contemplation or, equally, by means of action. Starting from this conception we must therefore evaluate the character of the decline of Western civilization in a different way. The tradition of action is in the nature of the Aryan Western races. This tradition has, however, undergone a progressive deviation. The modern West has thus come to know and honor only a secularized and materialized form of action, devoid of any point of contact with transcendence, a desecrated activity, which has necessarily degenerated fatally into fever and mania and become action for the sake of action, merely producing simple mechanical effects conditioned by time. In the modern world ascetic and authentically contemplative values cannot be drawn into correspondence with such degenerate action either, but only a confused culture and a lifeless and conventional faith. This is the point of reference for our analysis of the situation. If the watchword for any current movement of renewal is return to the origins, then recovering awareness of the ancient Aryan conception of action must be considered an essential task. This conception must operate with transformative effectiveness, evoking vital forces in the new man, aware of his race. Today, we ourselves propose to attempt a general survey of the speculative universe of the ancient Aryans in order to provide new evidence for some fundamental elements of our common tradition, with particular relevance to the meaning of combat, war and victory. For the ancient Aryan war had the general meaning of a perpetual fight between metaphysical powers. On the one hand there was the Olympian principle of light, the Uranic and solar reality; on the other hand, brute violence, the titanic telluric, barbaric element in the classical sense, the feminine demonic substance. The motif of this metaphysical fight resurfaces continually through countless forms of myth in all traditions of Aryan origin. Any fight, in the material sense, was experienced with greater or lesser awareness as an episode in that antithesis. But the Aryan race considered itself to be the army of the Olympian principle. Accordingly, it is necessary to restore this conception among Aryans, as being the justification, or the highest consecration, of any hegemonic aspiration, but also of the very idea of empire, whose anti-secular character is basically very obvious. To the traditionally based worldview, all apparent realities are symbolic. This is therefore true of war as well, as is seen from the subjective and interior point of view. War and the path of God are thus merged into a single entity. The significant testimonies found within the Nordic German traditions regarding this are well known. It is necessary to note, however, that these traditions, in the terms in which they have reached us, have become fragmented and jumbled up, or constitute materialistic residues of higher, primordial Aryan traditions, often decayed to the level of popular superstitions. This consideration does not prevent us from establishing some essential motifs. First of all, as is well known, Valhalla is the center of celestial immortality, reserved mainly for heroes fallen on the battlefield. The lord of this place, Odin Wotan, is presented to us in the Ynglingasaga as having shown to the heroes the path which leads to the place of the gods, where immortal life flourishes. According to this tradition, no sacrifice or cult is more appreciated by the supreme God, and none produces richer fruits than that sacrifice which one offers as one falls fighting on the battlefield. In addition to this, behind the confused popular representation of the wield as here, this meaning is hidden. Through the warriors who, falling, offer a sacrifice to Odin, the power is increased which this god needs for the ultimate battle against the Ragnarökr, that is, the darkening of the divine, which has threatened the world since ancient times. This illustrates clearly the Aryan motif of the metaphysical struggle. In the Edda, it is said that no matter how great the number of the heroes gathered in Valhalla, they will never be too many for when the wolf comes. The wolf here is the symbol of dark and wild powers which the world of the Aesir had managed to chain and subdue. The Aryo-Iranian conception of Mithra, the sleepless warrior, who at the head of the Fravashi of his faithful wages battle against the enemies of the Aryan god of light, is completely analogous. We will soon deal with the Fravashi and their correspondence with the Valkyries of the Nordic tradition. For now, we would like to explain the general meaning of the holy war by means of other, concordant testimonies. It should not cause surprise if we refer in the first place to the Muslim tradition. Here, the Muslim tradition serves as transmitter of the Aryo-Iranian tradition. The idea of holy war, at least as far as the elements that we are considering are concerned, reached the Arabian tribes via the world of Persian speculation. It was, therefore, a late rebirth of a primordial Aryan heritage, and seen from this perspective we can certainly adopt it. Having said that, in the tradition in question two holy wars are distinguished, the Greater Holy War and the Lesser Holy War. The distinction is based on a saying of the Prophet, who, when he got back from a military expedition, said, "I return now from the Lesser to the Greater War." In this respect, the Greater Holy War belongs to the spiritual order. The Lesser Holy War, in contrast, is the physical struggle, the material war, fought in the outer world. The Greater Holy War is the struggle of man against the enemies he bears in himself. More precisely, it is the fight of the supernatural element, innate in man, against everything which is instinctual, passionate, chaotic and subject to the forces of nature. This is also the idea that reveals itself in a text of the ancient Aryan warrior wisdom, the Bhagavad Gita. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence and thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. The necessary condition for the inner work of liberation is that this enemy is destroyed once and for all. In the context of a heroic tradition, the Lesser Holy War, that is, external combat, serves only as something by means of which the Greater Holy War is achieved. For this reason, holy war and path of God are often treated as synonymous in the texts. Thus we read in the Quran, "So let those who sell the life of this world for the next world fight in the way of Allah. If someone fights in the way of Allah, whether he is killed or is victorious, we will pay him an immense reward." And further, "As for those who fight in the way of Allah, He will not let their actions go astray. He will guide them and better their condition, and He will admit them into the garden which He has made known to them." This is an allusion to physical death in war, which corresponds perfectly to the mors triumphalis, triumphant death, of the classical traditions. However, the same doctrine can also be interpreted in a symbolic sense. The one who, in the Lesser Holy War, has been able to live a Greater Holy War, has created within himself a force which puts him in a position to overcome the crisis of death. Even without getting killed physically, through the asceticism of action and combat, one can experience death, one can win inwardly and realize what is more than life. In the esoteric respect, as a matter of fact, paradise, the celestial realm and analogous expressions are nothing but symbolic representations, concocted for the people, of transcendent states of consciousness on a higher plane than life and death. These considerations should allow us to discern the same contents and meanings, under the outer garment of Christianity, which the Nordic Western heroic tradition was forced to wear during the Crusades in order to be able to manifest itself in the external world. In the ideology of the Crusade, the liberation of the Temple and the conquest of the Holy Land had points of contact, much more numerous than one is generally inclined to believe, with the Nordic Aryan tradition, which refers to the mystical Asgard, the remote land of the Aesir and heroes, where death does not reign and the inhabitants enjoy immortal life and supernatural peace. Holy war appeared as an integrally spiritual war, so much so that it could be compared literally by preachers to a bathing which is almost like the fire of purgatory, but before death. Saint Bernard declared to the Templars, "It is a glory for you never to leave the battle unless covered with laurels." But it is an even greater glory to earn on the battlefield an immortal crown. The absolute glory, attributed to the Lord who is above, in the skies, in excelsis Deo, is ordained also for the Crusader. Against this background Jerusalem, the coveted goal of the Lesser Holy War, could be seen in the twofold aspect of terrestrial city and celestial city, and the crusade proved to be the prelude to a true fulfillment of immortality. The oscillating military vicissitudes of the Crusades provoked bafflement, initial confusion and even a wavering of faith. But later their sole effect was to purify the idea of holy war from every residue of materiality. The ill-fated outcome of a crusade came to be compared to virtue persecuted by misfortune, a virtue whose value can be judged and rewarded only in the light of a supra-terrestrial life. Beyond victory or defeat, the judgment of value focused on the spiritual dimension of action. Thus, the holy war was worthwhile for its own sake, irrespective of its visible results, as a means to reach a supra-personal realization through the active sacrifice of the human element. The same teaching appears, elevated to a metaphysical plane of expression, in a famous Hindu Aryan text, the Bhagavad Gita. The humanitarian compassion and the emotions which hold the warrior Arjuna back from fighting against the enemy are characterized by the god as impurities, not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets but to infamy. Instead, the god promises the following. Either you will be killed on the battlefield and attain the heavenly planets, or you will conquer and enjoy the earthly kingdom. Therefore, get up with determination and fight. The inner disposition to transmute the lesser holy war into the greater holy war is clearly described in the following terms. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence and thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Equally clear expressions assert the purity of this action. It must be wanted for itself, beyond every material aim, beyond every passion and every human impulse. Do thou fight for the sake of fighting, without considering happiness or distress, loss or gain, victory or defeat, and by so doing you shall never incur sin. As a further metaphysical foundation, the god enlightens his listener on the difference between absolute spirit, which is indestructible, and the corporeal and human elements, which possess only illusory existence. On the one hand, Arjuna becomes aware of the metaphysical unreality of what one can lose or cause others to lose, that is, the ephemeral life and the mortal body. On the other hand, Arjuna is led to experience the manifestation of the divine as a power which sweeps the one who experiences it away into irresistible absoluteness. Compared to this force, any conditioned form of existence appears as a mere negation. When this negation is itself continuously and actively negated, that is, when every limited form of existence is overwhelmed or destroyed in combat, this force becomes terrifyingly evident. It is in these terms that the energy suitable to provoke the heroic transformation of the individual can be properly defined. To the extent that he is able to act in the purity and absoluteness which we have indicated, the warrior breaks the chains of the human, evokes the divine as metaphysical force of destruction of the finite, and attracts this force effectively into himself, finding in it his illumination and liberation. The evocative watchword of another text, belonging to the same tradition, is appropriate here. Life, like a bow. The mind, like the arrow. The target to pierce, the supreme spirit, to join mind to spirit as the shot arrow hits its target. It is highly significant that the Bhagavad Gita presents these teachings, which explain how the higher form of the metaphysical realization of combat and heroism should be understood as referring to a primordial Aryan heritage of a solar nature. These teachings were in fact given by the sun to the primordial legislator of the Aryans, Manu, and subsequently maintained by a sacred dynasty of kings. In the course of centuries they came to be lost and were therefore newly revealed by the divinity, not to a priest, but to a representative of the warrior nobility, Arjuna. What we have discussed so far allows us to understand also the intimate content of another group of classical and Nordic traditions. We must start with a simple observation. In these traditions, certain specific symbolic images appear exceptionally often, that of the soul as demon, double, genius and the like, those of the Dionysian entities and the goddess of death, and, finally, that of a goddess of victory, who often appears also as goddess of battle. To understand these we should first clarify the meaning of the image of the soul as demon, genius or double. The man of classical antiquity symbolized in the demon or double a deep force, which is the life of life, so to speak, insofar as it rules over all the corporeal and animic events which ordinary consciousness does not reach, but which, however, are determinative of the contingent existence and destiny of the individual. A close relationship was believed to exist between this entity and the mystical powers of race and blood. The demon seems in many aspects to be similar to the Lares, the mystical entities of a stock or of a progeny, of which Macrobius, for example, asserts. The gods are those who keep us alive, they feed our body and guide our soul. It can be said that there is a relationship between the demon and ordinary consciousness analogous to that which exists between the individuating principle and the individuated principle. The former is, according to the teaching of the ancients, a supra-individual force, superior, therefore, to birth and death. The latter, that is, individuated consciousness, conditioned by the body and the outer world, is destined as a rule to dissolution or to an ephemeral and indistinct survival. In the Nordic tradition, the image of the Valkyrie has more or less the same meaning as that of the demon in classical antiquity. In many texts the image of the Valkyrie merges with that of the Filja, that is, a spiritual entity at work in man, to whose power the destiny of man is subject. And as Kinfilja the Valkyrie is, like the Lares of ancient Rome, the mystical power of the blood. The same thing applies to the Fravashi of the Aryo-Iranian tradition. The Fravashi, a famous Orientalist explains, is the intimate power of any human being, it is what keeps him alive and sees to it that he is born and exists. At the same time the Fravashi are, like Roman Lares, related to the primordial powers of a stock, and are, like the Valkyries, terrifying goddesses of war, dispensers of fortune and victory. This is the first connection we wish to examine. This mysterious power, which is the deep soul of the race and the transcendent factor at work in the individual, what can it have in common with the goddess of war? To understand this point correctly, it is necessary to remember that ancient Indo-Europeans had, so to speak, an aristocratic and differentiated conception of immortality. Not all escape the dissolution of the I into that lemuric residuum of which Hades and Niflheim were ancient symbolic representations. Immortality is the privilege of the few, and, according to the Aryan conception, specifically the privilege of heroes. Continuing to live, not as a shadow, but as a demigod, is reserved to those which a special spiritual action has elevated from the one nature to the other. Here, we unfortunately cannot prove in extenso the following affirmation. From the operative standpoint, this spiritual action consisted of the transformation of the individual I from the form of ordinary human consciousness, which remains circumscribed and individuated, into a deep, supra-individual and individuating power, which exists beyond birth and death, a power to which we have said the notion of the demon corresponds. The demon is, however, beyond all the finite forms in which it manifests itself, and this not only because it represents the primordial power of an entire stock, but also with respect to intensity. Consequently, the abrupt passage from ordinary consciousness to the power symbolized by the demon causes a destructive crisis, a sort of rupture, as a result of the tension of a potential too strong for the human circuit. Let us suppose therefore the case in which, in completely exceptional conditions, the demon can itself, so to speak, burst out in the individual, making him feel its destroying transcendence. In this case a sort of living and active experience of death would be aroused. The second connection, that is, the reason why in the mythical representations of antiquity the image of the double or demon has been able to merge with that of the divinity of death, therefore becomes clear. In the Nordic tradition the warrior sees his Valkyrie as he dies or he experiences a mortal danger. Let us go further. In religious asceticism mortification, the renunciation of the I and the impulse to give oneself up to God, are the preferred means by which one attempts to cause the aforementioned crisis and to overcome it effectively. Expressions like mystical death or dark night of the soul, etc., which indicate this condition, are well known. As opposed to this, in the context of a heroic tradition the active impulse, the Dionysian unleashing of the element of action, is the preferred means to the same end. At the lowest degree of the corresponding phenomenology we observe, for example, dance when employed as a sacred technique to evoke and employ, through the ecstasy of the soul, forces which reside in its depths. Another life arises within the life of the individual when freed by the Dionysian rhythm, almost like the emergence of his own abysmal root. The Wieldes here, the Furies, the Erinyes and other analogous spiritual natures are symbolic representations of this force. They therefore correspond to a manifestation of the demon in its terrifying and active transcendence. Sacred games represent a higher level of this process. A still higher level is that of war. In this way we are led back again to the ancient Aryan conception of combat and warrior asceticism. The possibility of some such supranormal experience was acknowledged to reside at the peak of danger and of heroic combat. The Latin word ludere, to play, to fight, already seems to contain the idea of resolving. This is one of the many references to the property, innate to combat, of freeing one from individual limitation and of bringing to emergence free forces which are latent in the depths. The third analogy draws its origin and foundation from this. The demon, the Lares, the individuating I, etc., are identical not only to the Furies, the Erinyes, and other unleashed Dionysian natures, which themselves have numerous features in common with the goddess of death, they correspond also to the virgins who guide the attacker in battle, the Valkyries and the Fravashi. The Fravashi, for example, are referred to in the texts as the terrifying, the omnipotent, those who storm and grant victory to the one who invokes them, or, to say it better, to the one who evokes them within himself. It is a short step from here to our final analogy. The same warlike entities assume finally in Aryan traditions the features of goddesses of victory, a metamorphosis which marks precisely the happy fulfillment of the inner experiences in question. Just like the demon or double, they signify a deep and supra-individual power, which remains in its latent state during ordinary consciousness, just as the Furies and the Erinyes reflect a special manifestation of demonic eruptions and outbursts, and the goddesses of death, Valkyries, Fravashi, etc. refer to the same situations, insofar as these are made possible by means of heroic combat, so the goddess of victory is the expression of the triumph of the I over this power. It marks the successful impulsion towards a condition situated beyond the danger innate in the ecstasy and the sub-personal forms of destruction, a danger always waiting in ambush behind the frenetic moment of Dionysian action and of heroic action itself. What finds expression in this representation of mythical consciousness is therefore the impulse towards a spiritual, truly supra-personal state, which makes free, immortal, inwardly indestructible, which, as it is said, makes, of the two, one, the two elements of the human essence. Let us come now to the overall meaning of these ancient heroic traditions, that is, to the mystical conception of victory. The fundamental idea was that there was an effective correspondence between the physical and the metaphysical, between the visible and the invisible, a correspondence whereby the works of the spirit manifested supra-individual features and were expressed through real operations and facts. From this presupposition, a spiritual realization was preordained as the secret spirit of certain warlike enterprises of which concrete victory would be the crown. Accordingly, the material, military dimension of victory was regarded as the correlative of a spiritual fact, which brought the victory about in accordance with the necessary relationship between the interior and exterior worlds. Victory, then, appears as the outward and visible sign of a consecration and a mystical rebirth achieved at the same point. The Furies and death, whom the warrior has faced materially on the battlefield, contested spiritually within him in the form of a threatening eruption of the primordial forces of his being. As he triumphs over these, victory is his. It thus becomes clear why, in the traditional world, victory assumed a sacred meaning. Thus, the chieftain, acclaimed on the battlefield, provided a living experience of the presence of a mystical power which transfigured him. The deep meaning of the otherworldly character bursting out in the glory and the divinity of the victor, the fact that, in ancient Rome, the celebration of the triumph assumed features much more sacred than military, becomes therefore comprehensible. The recurrent symbolism in ancient Aryan traditions of victories, Valkyries and analogous entities which guide the soul of the warrior to the sky, is revealed to us in a completely different light now, as does the myth of the victorious hero, such as the Dorian Hercules, who obtains the crown which makes him share in Olympian immortality from Nike, the goddess of victory. The extent to which the perspective which wants to see only poetry, rhetoric and fables in all this is distorted and superficial becomes clear now. Mystical theology teaches that the beatifying spiritual vision is achieved in glory, and Christian iconography puts the aureole of glory around the heads of saints and of martyrs. All this indicates a heritage, albeit faded, of our more elevated heroic tradition. The Aryo-Iranian tradition already knew, in fact, glory, vareno, understood as celestial fire, a glory which comes down on kings and chiefs, renders them immortal and in victory testifies for them. And, in classical antiquity, the radiating royal crown symbolized glory precisely as solar and celestial fire. In the Aryan world, light, solar splendor, glory, victory, divine royalty are images and notions which appear in the tightest conjunction, not in the sense of abstractions and inventions of man, but rather with the meaning of latent potentialities and absolutely real actualized capacities. In such context, the mystical doctrine of fight and victory represents for us a luminous apex of our common tradition of action. Today this tradition speaks to us in a way which is still comprehensible, provided, of course, that we renounce its outer and contingent modalities of manifestation. If we want to go beyond an exhausted, battered spirituality, built upon speculative abstractions and pietistic feelings, and at the same time to go beyond the materialistic degeneration of action, what better points of reference can be found today than the aforementioned ideals of ancient Aryan man? But there is more. In the West, spiritual and material tensions have become entangled to such a degree in recent years that they can only be resolved through combat. With the present war, an age goes towards its end and forces are gaining ground which can no longer be dominated by abstract ideas, universalistic principles or myths conceived as mere irrationalities, and which do not in themselves provide the basis for a new civilization. A far deeper and far more essential form of action is now necessary so that, beyond the ruins of a subverted and condemned world, a new age breaks through for Europe. In this perspective, a lot will depend on the way in which the individual of today is able to give shape to the living experience of combat, that is, on whether he is in a position to assume heroism and sacrifice as catharsis, and as a means of liberation and of inner awakening. This work of our combatants, inner, invisible, far from gestures and grandiloquences, will have a decisive character not only for the conclusion, victorious and definitive, of the events of this stormy period, but also for the configuration and the attribution of the sense of the order which will rise from victory. Combat is necessary to awaken and temper that force which, beyond onslaughts, blood and danger, will favor a new creation with a new splendor and a powerful peace. For this reason it is on the battlefield that pure action must be learned again today, action not only in the sense of virile asceticism, but also in the sense of purification and of path towards higher forms of life, forms valid in themselves and for themselves. This means precisely a return to ancient Aryo-Western tradition. From remote times, this evocative watchword still echoes down to us. Life, like a bow. The mind, like the arrow. The target to pierce, the supreme spirit, to join mind to spirit as the shot arrow hits its target. The one who still experiences combat today, in the sense of this acknowledgement of this profession, will remain standing while others will collapse, and his will be an invincible force. This new man will overcome within himself any drama, any dusk, any chaos, forming, with the advent of the new times, the principle of a new development. According to the ancient Aryan tradition, such heroism of the best men can assume a real evocative function, that is, it can re-establish the contact, lost for centuries, between world and supra-world. Then the meaning of combat will be, not horrible slaughter, nor desolate destiny conditioned by the will to power alone, but a test of the good reason and divine vocation of a stock. Then the meaning of peace will not be renewed drowning in colorless bourgeois everyday life, nor the lack of the spiritual tension found in combat, but the fullness of the tension itself. The blood of heroes is closer to the Lord than the ink of scholars and the prayers of the pious. The traditional conception is also based on the presupposition that, far more than individuals, the mystical primordial powers of the race are at work in holy war. These powers of the origins are those which create worldwide empires and bring to men victorious peace.